In the spaces between what we are taught and what the stones themselves whisper, there exists a civilization so vast, so architecturally magnificent, that its very existence challenges every foundation of our accepted timeline. Tartaria, a name that appears on maps for centuries, then vanishes as if by design, leaving behind only impossible buildings, inexplicable infrastructure, and questions that mainstream academia refuses to ask. If you find yourself drawn to the mysteries that live in the margins of official history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your world right now. I love seeing how these forgotten stories connect us across the globe. Tonight, we follow the trail of a lost empire whose fingerprints cover continents, whose architectural DNA pulses through cities we inhabit daily, yet whose story has been methodically erased from memory. Welcome to historic sleep. The first whispers of Tartaria's existence come not from dusty archaeological sites or crumbling manuscripts, but from something far more tangible and troubling, the maps themselves. For nearly 3 centuries, from the 1500s through the early 1800s, the world's most respected cartographers consistently depicted vast territories across Asia and parts of Eastern Europe under a single unified designation, Tartary, or in its various linguistic forms, Tartaria. These were not the rough sketches of fantasy or the hopeful projections of unexplored territories. These were the carefully surveyed, meticulously detailed works of masters like Gerardus Mercator, whose 1595 world map shows Tartaria stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean. Abraham Ortelius, often called the creator of the first modern atlas, depicted similar vast Tartarian domains in his Theatrum Orbis Terrarum. The prestigious Blaeu family of Amsterdam, whose atlases were considered the pinnacle of cartographic accuracy in the 17th century, consistently showed Tartary not as a vague region, but as a well-defined empire with clear boundaries, major cities, and established trade routes. What makes these depictions so remarkable is their consistency across different nations, different time periods, and different cartographic traditions. Dutch map makers agreed with French ones. German cartographers confirmed English observations. Russian maps aligned with Italian ones. This was not a case of one source copying another's errors, but rather multiple independent confirmations of the same geopolitical reality. The boundaries these maps describe are staggering in scope. Great Tartary, as it was often designated, encompassed much of what we now call Siberia, Mongolia, and vast stretches of Central Asia. Chinese Tartary covered regions that today include Xinjiang and parts of Tibet. Independent Tartary appeared to govern territories in what we now know as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and surrounding regions. The total area under Tartarian control, if these maps are to be believed, would have made it the largest contiguous empire in human history, dwarfing even the Mongol Empire at its peak. Yet perhaps most intriguing are the capital cities marked on these maps. Tobolsk, depicted as a major Tartarian centre, did indeed exist and was a significant administrative hub in Siberia, but other cities marked with equal prominence seem to have vanished from the historical record entirely. Cities with populations that, according to the cartographic evidence, should have numbered in the hundreds of thousands, complete with the infrastructure necessary to support such urban centres across the harsh landscapes of northern Asia. The trade routes depicted on these maps tell their own story. Detailed pathways connect Tartarian cities not only to each other, but to major commercial centres throughout Europe, the Middle East, and the Far East. These are not speculative trade routes based on geographic possibility, but carefully documented paths that imply regular established commerce. The precision with which these routes are drawn, including the notation of way stations, river crossings, and seasonal variations, suggests intimate knowledge that could only come from actual use over extended periods. Consider the 1754 map by the French cartographer Guillaume de Lisle, considered one of the most accurate map makers of his era. His carte de Tartary shows not just political boundaries, but geological features, river systems, and mountain ranges within Tartarian territory with a level of detail that would have required extensive surveying. The Yenisei, Ob, and other major Siberian rivers are depicted with remarkable accuracy. including tributaries and seasonal flooding patterns that modern geography has confirmed. But then, something extraordinary happens in the cartographic record. Beginning in the late 1700s and accelerating through the 1800s, Tartary begins to shrink on maps. Not gradually, as one might expect from natural political evolution, but systematically, as if being deliberately erased. By the mid-1800s, the vast territories that had been consistently labelled Tartary for 3 centuries are suddenly divided among the Russian Empire, China, and various smaller political entities, with no explanation for how such a massive empire dissolved so completely that it left virtually no trace in the historical record. The disappearance is not merely political but cultural. The languages these people spoke, the governmental systems they employed, the architectural styles they developed, even the technologies they used, all seemingly vanished without leaving the kinds of artifacts, documents, or cultural influences that typically survive the collapse of great civilizations. It is as if millions of people occupying territories larger than modern Russia simply evaporated from history. This erasure becomes even more puzzling when we examine the economic implications of such a vast territory. The resources contained within historical Tartary, the furs, minerals, timber, and agricultural potential of Siberia, the strategic position controlling trade routes between east and west would have made it one of the wealthiest regions on Earth. Yet there is virtually no record of this wealth in the archives of neighbouring powers. No major wars of conquest to claim these riches, no diplomatic correspondence discussing trade agreements or territorial disputes, no mention in the financial records of European banks or trading companies. The mapmakers themselves seem to have been remarkably well informed about territories that modern history tells us were largely unexplored wilderness. The accuracy with which they depicted geographical features, climate patterns, and even seasonal phenomena suggests direct observation, or, at minimum, detailed reports from people who had spent considerable time in these regions. Yet if such extensive knowledge existed, where are the exploration accounts, the travel journals, the trading company records that would have accumulated from centuries of contact with such a vast civilization? Some researchers have noted that certain maps from this period contain annotations that are difficult to interpret in conventional historical terms. Notations about seasonal cities that appear and disappear according to astronomical events. References to stone rivers and singing mountains that could refer to geological features unknown to modern science or misunderstood due to translation errors, symbols marking locations as forbidden to outsiders or accessible only during the white nights, suggesting restrictions or limitations on contact that imply a level of organization and control inconsistent with the primitive nomadic societies that official history claims inhabited these regions. The linguistic evidence adds another layer of mystery. Many of the place names within historical Tartary bear no resemblance to the languages of peoples who supposedly lived there according to conventional ethnography. Instead, they often contain linguistic elements that appear across vast geographical distances, suggesting either a common administrative language or a level of cultural unity that would have required sophisticated communication and transportation networks. Even more puzzling is the way these maps handle the transition zones between Tartary and neighbouring civilizations. Rather than the vague, contested borderlands typical of frontier regions, the boundaries are depicted with precision, often following natural features like mountain ranges or major rivers, but sometimes cutting across terrain in ways that suggest surveyed political boundaries rather than natural or tribal divisions. The technology implied by some of these cartographic details is also worth considering. Several maps show transportation networks within Tartary that appear too sophisticated for the supposed technological level of the inhabitants. Roads that run straight across difficult terrain, bridges marked at river crossings that would have required advanced engineering, and what appear to be canal systems connecting distant water bodies. The famous 1706 map by Hermann Moll shows a network of what he labels Great Roads of Tartary, crisscrossing the empire with a regularity and directness that suggests centralized planning and substantial construction capabilities. The disappearance of Tartaria from maps coincides curiously with the period of European colonial expansion and the Industrial Revolution, As Western powers became increasingly interested in the resources and strategic positions of Asian territories, the vast unified empire that had dominated these regions for centuries began to fragment on paper. This timing raises uncomfortable questions about whether the erasure of Tartaria from maps reflected genuine political changes or something more systematic. What makes this erasure even more suspicious is the way it was handled in subsequent editions of the same atlases. Publishers would release new versions of previously successful maps, identical in almost every detail except for the systematic removal of Tartarian political designations. Roads that had connected Tartarian cities were either removed entirely or relabeled as ancient trade routes, with no explanation of who had built or maintained them. Cities that had been marked as Tartarian administrative centres were either deleted or redesignated as Russian outposts, often with notes indicating they were recently established. Despite having appeared on maps for centuries under different names, the scholarly community's response to these cartographic inconsistencies has been largely to ignore them. When pressed, historians typically explain Tartary as a general geographical term used by Europeans to describe unfamiliar Asian territories, similar to how India was once used to refer to vast regions of the East. But this explanation fails to account for the specificity of the cartographic evidence, the detailed city layouts, the precise boundary delineations, the sophisticated transportation networks, and the consistent treatment of Tartary as a unified political entity rather than a vague geographical designation. Moreover, the explanation doesn't address why such a vague geographical term would persist with such consistency across multiple centuries and different cartographic traditions, only to disappear so completely and so suddenly. Nor does it explain why the territories formerly labelled Tartary seem to have required virtually no colonization or civilization by the powers that supposedly replaced it, as if the infrastructure of civilization was already there, merely requiring new political labels. The implications of taking these maps at face value are staggering. If Tartaria existed as depicted, it represents a sophisticated, continent-spanning civilization that not only thrived for centuries, but did so in regions that official history describes as sparsely populated wilderness. The sudden disappearance of such an entity from the cartographic record, followed by its complete absence from historical narratives, suggests not the natural evolution of political boundaries, but a deliberate rewriting of history on an unprecedented scale. For those willing to follow this cartographic evidence where it leads, the questions multiply rather than resolve. If Tartaria was real, what happened to its people, its cities, its accumulated wealth and knowledge? If it was merely a cartographic error repeated for centuries, why did the world's best mapmakers persist in such detailed inaccuracy? And perhaps most troublingly, if a civilization of this scope could be erased so completely from the historical record, what else might have been forgotten, deliberately or otherwise, in the official narratives we accept as truth? The maps remember what the history books have chosen to forget. In their silent testimony lies the first thread of a mystery that, once pulled, begins to unravel everything we think we know about the recent past of human civilization. If the maps provide the first whisper of Tartaria's existence, the buildings themselves offer something far more substantial physical evidence that stands today in cities around the world, mute witnesses to a construction capability that official timelines struggle to explain. These structures, magnificent in scale and execution, present a troubling paradox. They exist, undeniably, but their creation seems to have required resources, techniques, and organizational capacity that the supposed builders of their era simply did not possess. The most dramatic examples come from what history calls the World's Fair era, roughly 1850 to 1915, when cities across America and Europe suddenly sprouted elaborate temporary exhibitions featuring architectural marvels of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago serves as perhaps the most striking example. In less than 3 years, organizers claimed to have constructed what amounted to an entire city, covering more than 600 acres, featuring hundreds of buildings designed in a classical architectural style that would have challenged even ancient Rome's capabilities. The official story tells us that these structures were temporary, built from a mixture of plaster, cement and jute fibre called staff, designed to be demolished after the fair's conclusion. Yet photographs from the construction period tell a different story. The buildings appear to be constructed from solid masonry, featuring intricate stone carving, massive foundations and architectural details that would have taken master craftsmen years to complete. The White City, as the Chicago Fair's central court was known, included structures with columns 60 feet in height, elaborate cornices, and sculptural programs that rivaled Europe's greatest cathedrals, all supposedly erected in less than 36 months by a workforce that had never attempted anything remotely similar. The logistics alone strained credibility. The transportation building, designed by Louis Sullivan, featured a doorway known as the Golden Door that required over 30,000 pieces of individual ornamentation. The manufacturers building covered 31 acres under a single roof, making it at the time the largest building in the world. The administration building's dome rose 262 feet above ground level, requiring sophisticated engineering to support its weight while maintaining the building's supposed temporary nature. When one considers that Chicago in 1893 had a total population of barely over 1 million people, the idea that such an elaborate complex could be designed, engineered, and constructed in such a short time frame becomes increasingly implausible. But the Chicago Fair was not an isolated incident. Similar exhibitions sprouted across the United States and Europe with suspicious regularity. The 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo featured elaborate temporary structures, including an electric tower that rose 375 feet and was visible from 30 miles away. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis covered over 1,200 acres and included more than 1,500 buildings. The 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, built on land that had supposedly been reclaimed from San Francisco Bay just for the occasion, featured a palace of fine arts with a towering rotunda that survives to this day, its classical design and solid construction belying its supposedly temporary origins. What makes these accomplishments even more remarkable is the speed with which they were not only constructed but demolished. Contemporary accounts describe the dismantling of these elaborate complexes with the same breathtaking efficiency with which they were supposedly built. Massive buildings that had taken months or years to erect were reduced to rubble in weeks, yet in an age when labour was expensive and materials valuable, one must ask why such magnificent structures would be built only to be destroyed. The official explanation that they were always intended as temporary becomes less convincing when one considers the level of craftsmanship and expense involved in their creation. The architectural styles of these World's Fair buildings present another puzzle. The overwhelmingly classical designs featuring Greek columns, Roman arches, Renaissance domes, and Baroque ornamentation seem oddly out of place in an era that was supposedly witnessing the birth of modern industrial architecture. The 1893 Chicago Fair occurred at the same time that architects like Louis Sullivan were developing the steel frame construction techniques that would define modern skyscrapers. Yet the fair's buildings eschewed these innovations in favour of styles that hadn't been popular for centuries. This classical revival extends beyond the World's Fairs to encompass a broader phenomenon in 19th century urban development. Cities across America and Europe witnessed the construction of elaborate civic buildings, libraries, museums, and railway stations in styles that seem to echo ancient architectural traditions. The New York Public Library, completed in 1911, features classical facades and interior spaces that rival ancient Roman baths in their grandeur. Union Station in Washington, D.C., built between 1907 and 1908, incorporates architectural elements from ancient Roman basilicas. Railway stations from the same era in cities like Berlin, Paris, and London feature similar classical elements executed with a level of craftsmanship that seems almost anachronistic for the industrial age. The technical aspects of these buildings raise additional questions. Many feature construction techniques that were supposedly lost arts, revived by architects who somehow possessed knowledge of ancient building methods. the use of load-bearing masonry construction, elaborate stone carving, and complex geometrical relationships in design suggest either an unlikely renaissance in traditional building crafts or the continuation of techniques that had never actually been abandoned. The precision with which these classical elements were executed implies not just theoretical knowledge, but practical experience with traditional construction methods. Even more puzzling is the infrastructure that supported these building projects. The construction of elaborate World's Fair complexes required not just skilled labour, but entire industries capable of producing specialised materials, ornamental elements, and structural components. Where were the workshops that carved the thousands of decorative elements? Who manufactured the specialised hardware, the custom glass, the elaborate metalwork that these buildings required? The industrial capacity necessary to support such projects should have left traces in the economic records of the period, yet such evidence is remarkably sparse. The phenomenon extends to residential architecture as well. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed the construction of elaborate Victorian mansions, featuring complex woodwork, intricate metalwork, and architectural details that required sophisticated craftsmanship. These houses appeared not just in major cities, but in small towns across America, suggesting a widespread availability of skilled artisans and specialized materials that seems inconsistent with the period's supposed technological limitations. Perhaps most intriguingly, many of these structures exhibit evidence of having been built to accommodate technologies that wouldn't be widely available for decades. Elaborate electrical systems, sophisticated plumbing, central heating and cooling systems, and communication networks appear in buildings that were supposedly constructed before such technologies were commercially viable. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair featured extensive electrical illumination at a time when electric lighting was still a novelty in most American homes. The buildings included telephone systems, pneumatic message delivery, and even early forms of air conditioning technologies that wouldn't become standard until much later. The speed with which certain architectural styles spread across vast geographical distances also raises questions. The classical revival that characterizes so much late 19th century construction appeared almost simultaneously in cities separated by thousands of miles. Architectural elements, decorative motifs, and construction techniques that emerged in one location would appear in others with a rapidity that seems to exceed the normal speed of cultural diffusion. This suggests either unprecedented communication and coordination among architects and builders, or the possibility that these styles weren't actually being invented, but rather being revived or continued from earlier traditions. The demolition of these structures presents its own mysteries. Contemporary photographs show the systematic destruction of elaborate buildings that appear to have been constructed with permanence in mind. The methods used to demolish these structures, often involving explosives or heavy machinery, seem disproportionate to what should have been relatively simple temporary constructions. More puzzling still, the debris from these demolitions seems to have vanished with remarkable completeness. Given the scale of these buildings and the materials involved in their construction, their demolition should have produced enormous quantities of reusable stone, metal, and other materials. Yet there are few records of such materials being salvaged, sold, or reused. The workforce required for these projects also presents logistical challenges. The construction of major World's Fair complexes would have required thousands of skilled craftsmen working simultaneously. Stonemasons, carvers, metalworkers, glaziers, and other specialists whose services would have been in high demand. Yet there are remarkably few biographical records of the individual artisans who supposedly created these marvels. No personal accounts from the master craftsmen, no documentation of the workshops and ateliers that would have been necessary to train such a workforce, no records of the specialized tools and equipment that such projects would have required. The question of architectural knowledge itself becomes problematic. The accurate reproduction of classical architectural elements requires not just aesthetic understanding, but practical knowledge of structural engineering, proportional relationships, and construction techniques. The architects and builders of the World's Fair era demonstrated mastery of architectural traditions that official history suggests had been largely abandoned for centuries. This implies either an unlikely renaissance in classical architectural education, or the possibility that such knowledge had never actually been lost. When viewed collectively, these architectural phenomena suggest something far more complex than a simple revival of classical styles. The speed of construction, the sophistication of technique, the coordination of effort across vast distances, and the systematic nature of subsequent demolition all point toward capabilities and organization that exceed what conventional history attributes to the builders of this period. The buildings themselves stand as monuments to possibilities that official timelines struggle to accommodate evidence in stone and steel that the 19th century may have been far more accomplished and far more mysterious than we have been led to believe. For those willing to consider the implications, these architectural testimonies raise profound questions about the continuity of human knowledge and capability. If such sophisticated building techniques were available in the 19th century, where did they come from, and why were they abandoned? If the elaborate structures of the World's Fair era were truly temporary constructions, why were they built with such permanence and subsequently destroyed so systematically? And perhaps most troubling of all, if architectural capabilities of this scope existed just over a century ago, what else might have been possible that has since been forgotten or deliberately obscured? The buildings remember what the history books choose to overlook. In their silent grandeur lies evidence of human potential that challenges our assumptions about technological progress and cultural continuity. They stand as monuments to capabilities that may have been far greater and far more recently present than conventional wisdom suggests. Among the most intriguing aspects of the architectural marvels that dot our landscapes are the peculiar features that seem to serve no decorative purpose in our current understanding, yet appear with such consistency across different buildings and eras that they suggest functionality we no longer comprehend. These elements, elaborate cupolas, ornate spires, intricate metalwork extending high above roof lines, complex arrangements of spheres and rods, may represent the remnants of a sophisticated energy system that once powered civilization in ways we've forgotten how to recognize. The evidence begins with the buildings themselves. Across the world, structures from the late 18th and 19th centuries feature architectural elements that seem disproportionate to their supposed aesthetic function. The elaborate weather vanes, cupolas, and spires that crown these buildings are far more complex than simple wind direction indicators or decorative elements would require. Many feature multiple metal rods, spheres of varying sizes, and intricate geometric arrangements that seem designed to interact with atmospheric conditions in ways that go beyond mere ornamentation. Consider the characteristic spires and domes that define the skylines of so many cities built during this period. These structures, often reaching heights of several hundred feet, required enormous investment in materials and labor to construct. The official explanation for their prevalence is architectural fashion, a desire to create impressive civic monuments that would demonstrate municipal prosperity and sophistication. Yet when examined more closely, these spires and domes exhibit features that suggest they may have served a more practical purpose. The metalwork that crowns these structures is particularly revealing. Rather than simple decorative elements, many feature complex arrangements of conductors, insulators, and what appear to be collection devices. The spires often terminate not in simple ornamental finials, but in elaborate metal constructions featuring multiple rods, spheres, and geometric forms arranged in patterns that seem almost engineered for maximum atmospheric interaction. The metals used, typically copper, brass, or bronze, are all excellent electrical conductors, chosen not for their aesthetic properties, but for their ability to channel electrical current. The positioning of these structures also suggests functionality beyond decoration. They are typically placed at the highest points of buildings, often elevated even further by elaborate towers and supports that seem designed to maximize their height above the surrounding structures. This positioning would be optimal for collecting atmospheric electricity, which increases with elevation and is most readily accessible at the highest available points. The consistent height relationships between these spires and their surrounding buildings suggest not random architectural choices, but careful calculation based on understood principles of atmospheric electrical phenomena. The internal structure of many of these buildings provides additional clues. Buildings from this period often feature elaborate metal frameworks that extend throughout the structure, not just in the visible architectural elements, but in hidden frameworks that run through walls, floors, and ceilings. These metal networks, typically explained as early electrical wiring or structural support, often seem far more extensive and complex than either function would require. They form intricate patterns throughout the building, connecting the atmospheric collection devices on the roof to various points throughout the interior spaces. Some of the most compelling evidence comes from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which featured elaborate electrical illumination at a time when electric lighting was still rare in most American homes. The fair was powered by what was officially described as a revolutionary electrical system designed by Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse. Yet the scale of the electrical display, thousands of light bulbs illuminating hundreds of buildings across the 600-acre site, seems to exceed what the supposed power generation capabilities of the era could have supported. Contemporary accounts describe the fair's illumination as almost magical, with buildings outlined in thousands of incandescent bulbs creating a spectacle that could be seen for miles. The electricity building alone featured over 100,000 light bulbs, while the total electrical consumption of the fair was estimated at over 12,000 kilowatts, an enormous electrical load that would have required massive generating capacity. Yet there are few records of the electrical generating equipment that would have been necessary to power such a display, and the infrastructure that did exist seems inadequate to the task. Tesla himself left tantalizing hints about alternative approaches to electrical power distribution that might explain these anomalies. His experiments with wireless power transmission, atmospheric electricity, and what he called terrestrial electricity suggest possibilities for power generation and distribution that don't require the massive generating plants and distribution networks that conventional electrical systems demand. Tesla's Colorado Springs experiments demonstrated the transmission of electrical power through the Earth itself, using the planet as a conductor and the atmosphere as a power source. The architectural elements that appear so consistently on buildings from this period may represent a practical application of Tesla's theoretical insights. The elaborate spires, domes, and metalwork could have functioned as atmospheric electrical collectors, gathering power from natural atmospheric electrical phenomena and channeling it through the building's internal metal framework to provide illumination and other electrical services. Such a system would explain the prevalence of these architectural elements, their consistent design features, and their sudden disappearance from later construction. The timing of this disappearance is significant. The elaborate atmospheric collection systems that characterize buildings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries began to vanish from new construction at roughly the same time that centralized electrical power distribution systems became standard. As cities developed electrical grids powered by coal and oil-burning generating plants, the need for individual buildings to collect their own atmospheric power would have diminished. The complex spires, cupolas, and metalwork that had once served essential functions became merely decorative and eventually disappeared entirely from architectural practice. This transition also coincides with significant changes in the economic structure of power generation. Atmospheric electricity, if it could be reliably harvested, would have represented a free and unlimited power source available to any building equipped with appropriate collection equipment. The development of centralized power generation, by contrast, created opportunities for large-scale commercial enterprises to control and profit from electrical power distribution. The abandonment of atmospheric power collection may have been driven as much by economic considerations as by technological ones. The buildings themselves provide evidence of this transition. Many structures from the period show signs of having been modified or retrofitted, with original atmospheric collection equipment removed or simplified. Elaborate spires have been shortened or simplified, complex metalwork has been removed or replaced with decorative elements that lack the original functionality, and internal metal frameworks have been modified to accommodate conventional electrical wiring. These modifications often appear to have been made decades after the original construction, suggesting that the buildings were adapted to new power systems rather than having been designed for them from the beginning. Photographic evidence from the period also supports this interpretation. Early photographs of cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco show skylines dominated by elaborate spires, domes, and atmospheric collection devices. Later photographs of the same cities show many of these features removed or simplified, with the characteristic atmospheric collection equipment replaced by simpler decorative elements or eliminated entirely. The systematic nature of these changes suggests not random architectural evolution, but a deliberate modification of existing infrastructure. The theoretical basis for atmospheric power collection was well understood during this period. Scientists of the 18th and 19th centuries were actively investigating atmospheric electrical phenomena, and many believed that the atmosphere contained vast reserves of electrical energy that could be harvested for practical use. Benjamin Franklin's experiments with lightning rods demonstrated that atmospheric electricity could be captured and controlled, while later researchers like Lord Kelvin and Nikola Tesla developed a more sophisticated understanding of how atmospheric electrical phenomena could be harnessed. The technology for atmospheric power collection would not have required scientific breakthroughs beyond what was available during this period. The necessary components, metal conductors, insulators, and simple electrical devices were all within the manufacturing capabilities of 19th century industry. What would have been required was not new technology but new applications of existing knowledge, combined with architectural practices that integrated power collection into building design from the ground up. The abandonment of these systems may explain some of the most puzzling aspects of modern urban development. The rapid electrification of cities in the early 20th century required enormous investments in power generation and distribution infrastructure, investments that would have been unnecessary if buildings were already equipped with independent power generation capabilities. The speed with which cities adopted centralized electrical systems suggests not that they were replacing primitive or inadequate power sources, but rather that they were replacing systems that worked well but offered fewer opportunities for centralized control and profit. The environmental implications of this technological transition are also worth considering. Atmospheric power collection, if it worked as these architectural elements suggest, would have been a completely clean and renewable energy source with no environmental impact. The shift to coal and oil-burning power plants that characterized early 20th century electrical development created environmental problems that atmospheric power collection would have avoided entirely. The abandonment of these systems may represent not technological progress, but a step backward from more sustainable power generation methods. For those willing to look beyond conventional explanations, the architectural evidence suggests that our ancestors may have possessed energy technologies that were more sophisticated and more sustainable than what replaced them. The elaborate spires, domes, and metalwork that crown so many buildings from this period may represent the remnants of a power generation system that was abandoned not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well to be profitable for those who sought to control energy distribution. The buildings themselves stand as monuments to possibilities that may have been deliberately forgotten, energy systems that drew power from the atmosphere itself, requiring no fuel, producing no pollution, and available to anyone with the knowledge to construct appropriate collection equipment. In their silent testimony lies the suggestion that the path of technological development we have followed may not have been the only one available, or necessarily the best one chosen. The systematic disappearance of Tartaria from maps and the mysterious abandonment of atmospheric power technologies represent individual threads in what may be a much larger tapestry, a coordinated rewriting of human history that obscures not just individual civilizations or technologies, but entire epochs of human development. The evidence suggests that sometime in the 18th and 19th centuries, human civilization underwent what can only be described as a reset, a period of profound disruption, followed by the establishment of new timelines, new histories, and new explanations for the world as it existed. The The mathematical impossibility of population growth as recorded in official statistics provides one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for this historical disruption. According to accepted demographic data, the world's population remained relatively stable for thousands of years, hovering between 200–300 million people, then suddenly exploded beginning in the 18th century. The official explanation for this phenomenon is the agricultural revolution followed by the industrial revolution, improvements in farming techniques and medical care that supposedly allowed populations to grow at unprecedented rates. Yet when examined closely, the mathematics of this population explosion don't add up. For populations to grow at the rates indicated in official statistics, birth rates would have needed to increase dramatically while death rates simultaneously plummeted. But the historical record shows that living conditions for most people actually worsened during the early Industrial Revolution, with increased urbanization leading to crowded, unsanitary conditions that should have increased mortality rather than decreased it. Medical advances that could account for significantly reduced death rates didn't appear until well into the 19th century, too late to explain the population boom that supposedly began much earlier. More puzzling still is the fact that this dramatic population increase appears in the historical record without the corresponding evidence of gradual social and economic development that such growth should have produced. Societies don't transition overnight from subsistence agriculture to complex industrial production. Such transitions require centuries of accumulated technological development, capital formation, and social organization. Yet the official timeline suggests that human societies accomplished in a few decades what should have taken many centuries to achieve. Archaeological evidence adds another layer of mystery to these timeline inconsistencies. Carbon dating of organic materials found in supposedly ancient structures often yields dates that are far more recent than the structure's apparent age and sophistication would suggest. Medieval cathedrals, ancient temples, and other monuments that appear to be centuries or even millennia old sometimes contain organic materials that date to within the last few hundred years. While archaeologists typically explain these anomalies as contamination or later repairs, the frequency and consistency of such findings suggest a pattern rather than random error. The technology evident in supposedly ancient structures also raises chronological questions. Buildings that official history dates to medieval or even ancient periods sometimes exhibit construction techniques, material sciences, and engineering solutions that seem far more advanced than the supposed technological capabilities of their builders. The precision of stonework, the sophistication of structural engineering, and the evidence of advanced tool use in these structures suggest capabilities that don't align with conventional timelines of technological development. Even more troubling are the instances where supposedly ancient structures show evidence of having been built to accommodate technologies that weren't officially invented until much later. Elaborate conduit systems that seem designed for electrical wiring, ventilation systems that suggest understanding of air circulation principles, and architectural features that appear optimized for artificial lighting all appear in buildings that predate the official invention of the technologies they seem designed to accommodate. The phenomenon extends beyond individual structures to entire cities. Urban centers across Europe and North America exhibit development patterns that seem inconsistent with gradual organic growth over centuries. Instead, many show evidence of having been laid out according to comprehensive plans that suggest sophisticated understanding of urban planning principles, engineering capabilities, and organizational resources that official timelines suggest weren't available when these cities were supposedly founded. The infrastructure of these cities presents particularly compelling puzzles. Elaborate water distribution systems, sophisticated sewage treatment facilities, and complex transportation networks appear in cities whose official founding dates suggest they should have developed such infrastructure gradually over many decades or centuries. Instead, many cities seem to have possessed advanced infrastructure from their earliest periods, as if this infrastructure was already present when the cities were established rather than having been developed afterward. Transportation networks provide another piece of this puzzle. The railroad systems that spread across Europe and North America in the 19th century were built with a speed and efficiency that seems to exceed what the supposed engineering and construction capabilities of the period should have allowed. More puzzling still, many of these rail lines follow routes that seem optimized for geographic and engineering considerations that suggest far more extensive surveying and planning than the official timelines would have permitted. The construction of transcontinental railroads in North America presents particular challenges to conventional timelines. The official story describes these railroads as heroic engineering achievements, accomplished by small crews of workers using primitive tools and equipment, often working in harsh and dangerous conditions. Yet the actual construction, including the blasting of tunnels through solid rock, the construction of massive bridges across deep canyons, and the laying of precise grades across thousands of miles of difficult terrain, would have required engineering capabilities, construction equipment, and organizational resources that far exceeded what was supposedly available. Contemporary photographs of railroad construction show evidence of massive earth-moving operations, precisely cut stone foundations, and construction techniques that suggest access to heavy machinery and sophisticated engineering tools. The speed with which these massive projects were completed also suggest construction capabilities far beyond what small crews with primitive tools could have accomplished. These photographs often show completed sections of railroad that appear to have been built with precision and permanence that belies the supposedly rushed and primitive conditions under which they were constructed. The synchronization of railroad construction across vast distances also raises questions about coordination and communication. Railroad systems that eventually connected to form transcontinental networks were built simultaneously from multiple starting points, requiring precise coordination to ensure that sections built hundreds of miles apart would connect properly. This level of coordination would have required communication and surveying capabilities that seem advanced for the supposedly primitive conditions under which these projects were undertaken. The cities that appeared along these railroad routes present their own mysteries. Many railroad towns sprang up almost overnight, complete with sophisticated infrastructure, elaborate commercial buildings, and residential neighborhoods that suggest planning and investment far beyond what would be expected for frontier settlements. These towns often featured amenities like electric lighting, running water, and telephone service that weren't supposed to be widely available until much later. The speed with which these communities developed suggests either remarkable organizational capabilities or the possibility that infrastructure was already present and merely required new inhabitants. Educational systems also underwent dramatic changes during this period, changes that aligned suspiciously with the timeline of the supposed historical reset. Public education systems were established across Europe and North America with remarkable uniformity, implementing standardized curricula that emphasize particular interpretations of history, science, and culture. These educational systems appeared not gradually, as one might expect from organic social development, but rapidly and with strong governmental support, as if they were part of a coordinated effort to establish new norms and understandings. The content of these educational systems is particularly revealing. The history curricula that were established during this period emphasized certain narratives while systematically excluding others. The timelines, cultural interpretations, and technological progressions that became standard in public education all support the narrative of gradual development from primitive to advanced societies, progression that required centuries of slow development rather than the possibility of more advanced civilizations that may have existed in the past. Libraries and archives also underwent systematic reorganization during this period. Many historical documents, maps, and records were consolidated into centralized collections, where access could be controlled and content could be standardized. Private collections were often acquired by public institutions, and many documents that didn't fit standard historical narratives were either relegated to restricted access or disappeared entirely from public view. This consolidation was officially described as preservation and organization, but the effect was to limit access to materials that might challenge officially accepted timelines. The printing industry also played a role in this historical standardization. The 19th century saw the mass production of standardized textbooks, reference works, and historical accounts that establish particular versions of history as authoritative. Earlier books and documents that contained different information were gradually replaced by these standardized accounts, creating a feedback loop where officially accepted narratives became the only widely available sources of historical information. Religious institutions also underwent changes that align with this pattern. Many traditional religious practices, local customs and folk traditions that contained historical information or alternative timelines were discouraged or suppressed in favor of standardized religious practices that emphasized approved historical narratives. Religious authorities who might have preserved alternative accounts of historical events were often replaced or marginalized, reducing the diversity of historical sources available to future generations. The cumulative effect of these changes was the establishment of historical narratives that support particular interpretations of human development, while systematically excluding alternatives. The populations that might have remembered different versions of recent history were either displaced, re-educated, or otherwise prevented from passing their knowledge to subsequent generations. The result is historical record that may be far more standardized and controlled than most people realize. For those willing to consider the implications, the evidence suggests that human history may have been far more complex and far more recently disrupted than official accounts acknowledge. The gaps, inconsistencies, and impossibilities in accepted timelines may not be errors or mysteries waiting to be solved, but evidence of a systematic effort to obscure or replace genuine historical knowledge with narratives that serve particular purposes. The question that emerges from this evidence is not just what really happened in human history, but who had the power and motivation to rewrite it so comprehensively. The coordination required to modify maps, demolish buildings, relocate populations, establish new educational systems, and standardize historical narratives across multiple countries and cultures would have required resources and authority on a scale that few institutions could have mustered. Yet the evidence suggests that exactly such a coordinated effort took place, reshaping human understanding of the past in ways that continue to influence our present. While the physical evidence of historical disruption can be found in demolished buildings, altered maps, and suspicious timelines, perhaps the most compelling testimony comes from those who claim to remember differently indigenous peoples, isolated communities, and traditional cultures whose oral histories preserve accounts that often contradict official narratives. These voices, systematically marginalized by mainstream academia, tell stories of recent catastrophes, missing populations, and technologies that vanish not in the distant past, but within living memory of their communities. Native American oral traditions across the continent contain remarkably consistent accounts of a period they often refer to as the Great Forgetting, or the time when the world changed. These stories describe a relatively recent period within the last few centuries rather than in mythological deep time, when the landscape was dramatically altered, vast populations disappeared, and survivors were forced to adapt to completely new circumstances. The Hopi, whose emergent stories we explored earlier in the context of underground refuges, also maintain detailed oral accounts of surface world catastrophes that forced their ancestors to seek shelter below ground. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their specificity about timing and geographic detail. Unlike mythological stories that are deliberately vague about temporal and spatial relationships, these oral histories contain precise references to landmarks, seasonal patterns, and astronomical events that allow them to be correlated with known historical periods. Many of these accounts place the major disruptions in the late 1700s and early 1800s, coinciding exactly with the period when Tartaria disappears from maps and when the supposed population explosion begins in official demographics. The Lakota maintain oral traditions describing vast cities that once existed across the Great Plains, cities that were not primitive encampments, but sophisticated urban centers with permanent structures, advanced agriculture, and complex social organization. These accounts describe the sudden abandonment of these cities not due to gradual cultural change, but due to catastrophic events that made continued habitation impossible. The survivors, according to these traditions, were forced to adopt nomadic lifestyles not because they preferred them, but because their permanent settlements had become uninhabitable. Similar accounts appear among Pacific Northwest tribes, who describe coastal cities that were lost not to gradual sea level change, but to sudden catastrophic events that altered coastlines and river systems within single generations. These stories often include details about technologies and social organization that seem far more sophisticated than the hunter-gatherer societies that European explorers encountered in these regions. The implication is that what Europeans interpreted as primitive societies were actually the surviving remnants of more complex civilizations that had recently been disrupted. Cherokee oral traditions speak of ancient cities in the southeast that featured stone buildings, elaborate earthworks, and agricultural systems that supported large populations. These accounts describe the systematic abandonment of these settlements, not due to voluntary migration, but due to environmental catastrophes that made continued habitation impossible. The Cherokee maintain that the mound-building cultures that archaeologists study were not their distant ancestors, but relatively recent predecessors whose advanced civilizations were disrupted within historical memory. Across the Atlantic, similar patterns appear in the oral traditions of indigenous peoples, who maintain accounts of recent catastrophic change. Sami peoples of northern Europe describe the sudden disappearance of permanent settlements that had existed in regions that are now considered uninhabitable wilderness. These accounts speak of advanced communities that possess sophisticated technologies for surviving in Arctic conditions, technologies that were lost when the communities themselves were abandoned or destroyed. Aboriginal Australians maintain oral traditions that describe vast inland cities and complex water management systems that existed in regions that are now desert. These traditions place these civilizations not in the distant dream time, but within historical periods that can be correlated with known astronomical events and geographical changes. The accounts describe the gradual or sudden abandonment of these inland settlements as water sources disappeared or became unreliable, forcing populations to adopt the nomadic desert survival strategies that European colonizers encountered. What unites these diverse oral traditions is not just their accounts of recent catastrophic change, but their descriptions of the technologies and social organization that were lost during these disruptions. Rather than describing gradual technological development from primitive to advanced states, these accounts suggest technological regression, the loss of sophisticated capabilities that had previously existed. This reversal of the conventional narrative of technological progress appears consistently across cultures that had no contact with each other during the periods when these events supposedly occurred. The preservation of these oral traditions themselves presents interesting questions about historical continuity. Traditional cultures typically maintain oral histories with remarkable accuracy across many generations, using sophisticated mnemonic techniques, ritual repetition, and cultural institutions specifically designed to preserve important knowledge. The consistency of these accounts across diverse cultures suggests not shared mythology, but shared historical experience of events that were significant enough to be preserved in communal memory. In many cases, these oral traditions contain technical knowledge that seems inconsistent with the supposedly primitive technological capabilities of the cultures that preserved them. Detailed astronomical observations, sophisticated understanding of geological processes, and practical knowledge of technologies that official history claims weren't available to these cultures all appear embedded in traditional stories and practices. This technical knowledge often seems to be fragmentary, as if it represents the remnants of more complete technological traditions that were partially lost during the disruptions described in the oral histories. Traditional medicine provides particularly compelling examples of this preserved technical knowledge. Indigenous medical traditions often contain sophisticated understanding of chemistry, pharmacology, and biological processes that seems far beyond what trial and error alone could have discovered. Many indigenous cultures possess detailed knowledge of plant chemistry, understanding not just which plants have medicinal properties, but why they work and how different compounds interact within biological systems. This level of knowledge suggests systematic scientific investigation rather than accidental discovery. implying previous access to more advanced scientific methodologies than official histories acknowledge. Agricultural knowledge preserved in traditional cultures also suggests technological capabilities that seem inconsistent with supposed primitive conditions. Complex crop rotation systems, sophisticated understanding of soil chemistry, and advanced plant breeding techniques appear across indigenous cultures worldwide. The Three Sisters agricultural system of North American indigenous peoples, for example, represents a sophisticated understanding of plant biology, soil science, and ecological relationships that produces yields comparable to modern industrial agriculture while maintaining soil health indefinitely. Engineering knowledge preserved in traditional cultures also hints at more advanced previous capabilities. Indigenous peoples across the Americas maintain detailed knowledge of construction techniques for building in earthquake zones, flood-prone areas, and other challenging environments. This knowledge often includes understanding of materials science, structural engineering principles, and construction techniques that produce buildings capable of surviving natural disasters that destroy modern structures. The systematic suppression of these traditional knowledge systems began in earnest during the same period when maps were being altered and historical narratives were being standardized. Colonial authorities, missionaries, and educational officials implemented policies specifically designed to eliminate traditional practices and replace them with approved alternatives. Children were removed from their communities and placed in boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak traditional languages or practice traditional customs. Traditional ceremonies and cultural practices were outlawed, and traditional leaders were replaced with approved authorities. This cultural suppression was often justified as modernization or civilization, but the effect was to eliminate sources of historical knowledge that might challenge official narratives. Traditional accounts of recent catastrophic changes, descriptions of more advanced previous civilizations, and technical knowledge that seemed inconsistent with primitive timelines all became targets for systematic elimination. The speed and thoroughness with which this cultural suppression was implemented suggests coordination and planning that goes beyond simple cultural chauvinism or religious zealotry. In some cases, traditional knowledge was preserved not through oral traditions, but through the continuation of practical skills and technologies that were maintained in isolated communities. Masonic guilds, craft traditions, and secret societies often preserved technical knowledge and historical accounts that were excluded from mainstream educational curricula. These groups maintained traditions of stonework, metallurgy, and architectural knowledge that enabled the construction of the elaborate buildings that characterized the 19th century architectural revival. The Masonic tradition, in particular, seems to have preserved knowledge of classical architectural principles, construction techniques, and symbolic systems that were essential to the World's Fair-era construction projects. The symbolic elements that appear consistently in Masonic traditions, geometric relationships, architectural proportions, and technical knowledge appear embodied in the buildings that were constructed during the period of architectural revival. This suggests that the knowledge necessary for these construction projects wasn't newly acquired, but was maintained through traditional channels that preserved older technical traditions. Secret societies and esoteric traditions also preserved historical accounts and technical knowledge that often contradict official narratives. These groups maintain traditions of natural philosophy, experimental science, and technological development that continue to operate alongside mainstream institutions. The knowledge preserved in these traditions often includes accounts of more advanced previous civilizations, descriptions of technologies that were subsequently lost, and historical timelines that differ significantly from official accounts. The preservation of this alternative knowledge in traditional communities, craft guilds, and secret societies suggests that the disruption and forgetting that characterizes official history was not complete. Fragments of older knowledge, more accurate historical accounts, and technical capabilities that were officially lost continue to exist in communities that maintain traditional practices despite official suppression. These surviving knowledge traditions represent repositories of information that could significantly revise our understanding of recent history if their accounts were taken seriously. For those willing to listen to these marginalized voices, The testimonies of traditional cultures suggest a radically different version of recent history than official accounts provide. Rather than gradual development from primitive to advanced conditions, these accounts suggest recent technological and social regression following catastrophic disruptions. Rather than empty wilderness waiting to be civilized, they describe landscapes that were recently abandoned by sophisticated civilizations. Rather than the triumph of progress over barbarism, they suggest the replacement of sustainable traditional knowledge with less effective modern alternatives. The implications of taking these alternative accounts seriously extend far beyond academic historical revision. If traditional accounts of recent catastrophic change are accurate, then current environmental and social challenges may be part of ongoing consequences of disruptions that began several centuries ago. The solutions to current problems may lie not in further technological development, but in recovering traditional knowledge that was systematically suppressed during the period of historical reset. The survivors remember what the history books choose to forget. In their oral traditions, practical knowledge, and cultural practices lies evidence of human potential and historical continuity that challenges everything we think we know about the recent past of human civilization. The systematic suppression of historical knowledge extends beyond the alteration of maps and the standardization of educational curricula into what may be the most troubling aspect of the entire phenomenon: the deliberate concealment, misinterpretation, or destruction of archaeological evidence that contradicts officially sanctioned historical narratives. Across North America and around the world, archaeological discoveries that could revolutionize our understanding of recent history have been quietly removed from public view, buried in restricted museum collections, or explained away through theoretical frameworks that preserve existing timelines regardless of the evidence. The phenomenon is perhaps most visible in North America, where the 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed numerous archaeological discoveries of unprecedented scope and significance. Newspaper accounts from this period regularly reported the discovery of elaborate burial mounds, sophisticated urban sites, and artifacts that seem to indicate the presence of advanced civilizations in regions that official history characterized as sparsely populated wilderness. These discoveries were initially celebrated as important contributions to understanding North American prehistory, but gradually disappeared from public discourse as historical narratives became more standardized. The Great Serpent Mound of Ohio represents a typical example of how such discoveries were reinterpreted to fit acceptable historical frameworks. When first investigated in the late 19th century, this massive earthwork stretching over 100 to 300 feet in length and featuring precise astronomical alignments was recognized as evidence of sophisticated engineering and astronomical knowledge. Early investigators noted that its construction would have required extensive planning, advanced surveying techniques, and coordinated labor involving hundreds or possibly thousands of workers over extended periods. Yet as historical narratives became standardized, interpretations of the Great Serpent Mound shifted to emphasize its primitive rather than sophisticated aspects. Rather than evidence of advanced engineering, it became an example of simple earthwork construction within the capabilities of hunter-gatherer societies. Rather than demonstrating sophisticated astronomical knowledge, its alignments were explained as coincidental or exaggerated. The complex logistics that its construction would have required were simply ignored in favor of interpretations that fit more primitive technological assumptions. This pattern of reinterpretation appears consistently across North American archaeological sites. Cahokia, the massive urban center near present-day St. Louis, was initially understood to have been a sophisticated city that at its peak may have housed more than 20,000 inhabitants and featured complex urban planning, advanced agricultural systems, and elaborate ceremonial architecture. Early investigators recognized Cahokia as evidence that North America had supported urban civilizations that rivaled European cities of the medieval period. But as standardized historical narratives took hold, Cahokia's significance was systematically downgraded. Rather than being understood as a true urban center, it was reclassified as a ceremonial complex or ritual center that supposedly never supported large permanent populations. The sophisticated urban planning that early investigators had documented was reinterpreted as coincidental arrangement of temporary structures. The advanced agricultural systems that would have been necessary to support large urban populations were either ignored or explained away as simple subsistence farming. Even more troubling are the numerous accounts of archaeological discoveries that were completely suppressed rather than reinterpreted. Newspaper reports from the 19th century describe the discovery of elaborate stone cities, sophisticated metallurgical sites, and burial complexes that contained artifacts of unprecedented sophistication. These discoveries were often initially reported in mainstream newspapers and investigated by respected archaeologists, but subsequently vanished from the archaeological record without explanation. The Smithsonian Institution played a particularly significant role in this process of archaeological suppression. Numerous contemporary accounts describe Smithsonian teams arriving at archaeological sites shortly after their discovery, removing artifacts and human remains, and subsequently publishing reports that either minimized the significance of the discoveries or omitted them entirely from official accounts. In some cases, entire archaeological sites seem to have been deliberately destroyed or buried after Smithsonian investigation, preventing further research that might have challenged official historical narratives. The systematic collection and suppression of giant human remains represents perhaps the most dramatic example of this archaeological cover-up. Newspaper accounts from across North America during the 19th and early 20th centuries regularly reported the discovery of human skeletons of unusual size, 7, 8, or even 9 feet in height, often found in elaborate burial contexts that suggested high status or ceremonial significance. These discoveries were initially treated as important scientific findings and were often displayed in local museums or reported in scientific publications. Yet these giant skeletons gradually disappeared from public view as historical narratives became standardized. Museums that had initially displayed them removed them from public exhibition. Scientific publications stopped reporting such discoveries. Most mysteriously, the physical remains themselves often vanished from museum collections, officially lost or misplaced despite having been carefully catalogued and studied when first discovered. The disappearance of these remains coincided with the development of theoretical frameworks that insisted such discoveries were impossible. Physical anthropology developed increasingly rigid standards for what constituted normal human variation, standards that excluded the possibility of significantly larger human populations. Any discoveries that contradicted these standards were automatically classified as hoaxes, misidentifications, or measurement errors, regardless of the quality of documentation or the credibility of the investigators who made the discoveries. This theoretical framework created a feedback loop where evidence was rejected, not because it was inadequately documented, but because it contradicted theoretical assumptions. Archaeological discoveries that suggested more advanced or more diverse human populations than official theories allowed were systematically excluded from consideration, ensuring that those theories remained unchallenged by inconvenient evidence. The suppression extended beyond North America to archaeological sites around the world where discoveries challenged accepted historical timelines. Advanced artifacts found in supposedly primitive contexts were either ignored, misinterpreted, or removed from public view. Sites that seemed to demonstrate technological capabilities that exceeded officially accepted levels for their supposed time periods were either reinterpreted to fit acceptable frameworks or simply excluded from mainstream archaeological discourse. The technological artifacts that appear in inappropriate archaeological contexts present particular challenges to official timelines. Precision-machined metal objects, sophisticated tool marks, and evidence of advanced metallurgy appear regularly in archaeological contexts that officially predate the technological capabilities necessary to produce them. Rather than acknowledging these discoveries as evidence that official technological timelines might be incorrect, out-of-place artifacts, or OOPArts as they are known in archaeological literature, are typically dealt with through a process of institutional marginalization rather than scientific investigation. Artifacts that clearly demonstrate advanced technological capabilities, but appear in contexts that contradict official timelines, are often relegated to storage facilities where they are effectively removed from further study. Academic careers that focus too heavily on such anomalous discoveries often suffer professional consequences that discourage other researchers from pursuing similar investigations. The control of access to archaeological sites and artifacts also plays a role in maintaining official narratives. Many significant archaeological sites are restricted to approved researchers who are unlikely to challenge existing theoretical frameworks. Independent researchers who might pursue alternative interpretations are often denied access to important sites or collections, limiting their ability to conduct research that might contradict official accounts. This control of access ensures that alternative interpretations of archaeological evidence remain marginalized regardless of their potential validity. Museum collections represent another point of control over archaeological evidence. Important artifacts are often held in restricted collections where access is limited to approved researchers. Even when such artifacts are occasionally displayed to the public, they are typically presented within interpretive frameworks that support official historical narratives. Alternative interpretations of the same evidence are rarely presented, giving museum visitors the impression that current official interpretations are the only possible explanations for the archaeological evidence. The standardization of archaeological education also contributes to the maintenance of official narratives. Archaeological training programs emphasize theoretical frameworks that support accepted historical timelines and discourage students from pursuing research that might challenge established interpretations. Students who show interest in anomalous discoveries or alternative interpretations often find themselves directed toward other specializations or discouraged from pursuing archaeological careers altogether. Professional archaeological organizations reinforce these tendencies through peer review processes that favor research supporting established theoretical frameworks. Papers that challenge accepted timelines or propose alternative interpretations of archaeological evidence face significantly greater scrutiny and are less likely to be published in mainstream journals. This publication bias creates the impression that official interpretations are more solidly supported by evidence than they actually are, since contradictory evidence is systematically excluded from mainstream discourse. The cumulative effect of these institutional mechanisms is the creation of an archaeological establishment that is structurally incapable of acknowledging evidence that contradicts official historical narratives. Even when such evidence is overwhelming, institutional mechanisms exist to minimize its significance, question its authenticity, or simply ignore it entirely. The result is an archaeological record that appears to support official historical timelines, primarily because contradictory evidence has been systematically excluded from consideration. For those willing to look beyond officially sanctioned interpretations, the suppressed archaeological evidence suggests a radically different version of recent history than mainstream accounts provide. Rather than gradual technological development over millennia, the evidence suggests that sophisticated technologies and complex civilizations existed much more recently than official timelines acknowledge. Rather than empty wilderness waiting to be populated, the archaeological evidence suggests that North America and other continents supported advanced civilizations within historical memory, civilizations whose traces have been systematically removed from public view. The archaeological cover-up represents perhaps the most troubling aspect of the historical reset because it involves the deliberate suppression of physical evidence rather than simply the reinterpretation of existing knowledge. When maps are altered or educational curricula are standardized, at least the evidence of these changes remains available to future researchers who might recognize the alterations. But when archaeological evidence is destroyed, removed from public view, or permanently lost, the opportunity for future revision of historical understanding may be permanently eliminated. The stones remember what the institutions choose to suppress. In their silent testimony lies evidence of human achievement and historical continuity that challenges the very foundations of accepted historical knowledge. But this evidence remains available only to those willing to look beyond official channels and institutional approval, a reminder that the most important discoveries about human history may lie not in what we are taught to see, but in what we are encouraged to overlook. Behind the systematic erasure of Tartaria and the broader historical reset lies a web of economic incentives so profound that it may explain not only why such a comprehensive rewriting of history was undertaken, but how it was coordinated across multiple nations and institutions with the precision necessary to make it successful. The transformation from abundance-based to scarcity-based economics, the establishment of debt-based monetary systems, and the creation of centralized control over energy and resources all align precisely with the timeline of historical disruption, suggesting that economic motives may have driven the entire process. The economic implications of Tartaria's existence, if the cartographic evidence is accurate, would have been staggering. The territories shown under Tartarian control contained some of the world's richest natural resources, the vast mineral wealth of Siberia, the fur-bearing regions of northern Asia, the strategic trade routes connecting Europe with the Far East. An organized civilization controlling these resources would have possessed economic power that could have rivaled or exceeded that of European colonial empires. The sudden availability of these resources for exploitation by other powers would have represented one of the greatest economic opportunities in human history. The timing of Tartaria's disappearance from maps coincides precisely with the period of most aggressive European colonial expansion and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. As European powers sought new sources of raw materials and new markets for manufactured goods, the territories formerly labelled Tartary would have represented prize acquisitions. But rather than the gradual conquest and colonization that characterized European expansion into other regions, the Tartarian territories seem to have become available with suspicious suddenness and completeness. The Russian Empire's expansion eastward during the 18th and 19th centuries officially brought vast Siberian territories under Russian control, territories that maps had previously shown as independent Tartarian domains. Yet this expansion is described in historical accounts as relatively peaceful settlement of sparsely populated wilderness, rather than the conquest of organized civilizations that the earlier maps suggest existed there. The absence of major military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, or resistance movements that should have accompanied the absorption of such vast territories suggests either that these regions were indeed largely empty, or that the populations that previously controlled them were no longer present to resist. The infrastructure that Russian expansion encountered in these territories also raises economic questions. The development of Siberia proceeded with remarkable speed, suggesting that much of the necessary infrastructure, transportation routes, communication systems, resource extraction facilities was already present rather than having to be constructed from scratch. The Trans-Siberian Railway, completed in the early 20th century, followed routes that seem optimally designed for geographic and engineering considerations, as if the pathways had been surveyed and planned long before construction began. The economic transformation of the North American continent presents similar patterns. The territories that European settlers encountered were described as largely uninhabited wilderness. Yet the speed with which these regions were developed suggests the presence of existing infrastructure that merely required new inhabitants rather than construction from the ground up. Transportation networks, communication systems, and resource extraction facilities appeared with a rapidity that seems to exceed what the supposed settlement patterns should have allowed. The railroad companies that drove American westward expansion represent particularly interesting examples of how economic interests may have shaped historical narratives. These companies received vast land grants from the federal government, millions of acres of supposedly empty territory that could be developed for profit. Yet many of these grants included regions that earlier maps had shown as populated and organized, raising questions about the legal and moral basis for transferring territories that may not have been as vacant as officially claimed. The speed with which railroad construction proceeded also suggests capabilities that may not have started from zero. Railroad routes that required extensive surveying, precise engineering, and massive earth-moving operations were completed in timeframes that seem impossible given the supposed primitive conditions and limited resources available to construction crews. Contemporary photographs show completed sections that appear to have been built with precision and permanence that suggests access to advanced construction techniques and equipment. The cities that appeared along these railroad routes developed with a sophistication that seems inconsistent with frontier conditions. Many featured elaborate commercial buildings, sophisticated infrastructure, and amenities that suggest significant capital investment and technical capabilities. The architectural quality of many railroad-era buildings matches or exceeds contemporary construction in established eastern cities, suggesting either remarkable prosperity in these frontier communities or the possibility that infrastructure was already present and merely required new inhabitants and economic activities. The banking and financial systems that emerged during this period also show evidence of coordination that goes beyond normal market development. The establishment of national banking systems, standardized currencies, and international financial relationships proceeded with remarkable uniformity across different countries, suggesting coordination at levels that would have required unprecedented cooperation among financial institutions. This financial infrastructure was essential to supporting the massive infrastructure projects and territorial development that characterized the 19th century. But the speed with which it was established suggests planning and preparation that may have preceded the developments it supposedly supported. The transition from local and regional economies to national and international economic systems also proceeded with suspicious uniformity. Traditional economic relationships that had developed over centuries were replaced with standardized systems that integrated local economies into larger networks controlled from centralized locations. While this integration was officially described as natural economic development, driven by technological improvements in transportation and communication, the speed and completeness of the transformation suggest deliberate coordination rather than organic market evolution. The establishment of controlled scarcity represents perhaps the most significant economic change that occurred during this period. Traditional economic systems based on local resource availability and direct exchange were replaced with systems that created artificial scarcity through centralized control of resource distribution. Resources that had previously been freely available became commodities that could only be accessed through approved economic channels, creating opportunities for profit and control that hadn't existed under previous economic arrangements. Energy systems provide the clearest example of this transition from abundance to artificial scarcity. If the atmospheric power collection systems suggested by 19th century architecture actually functioned, they would have provided free energy to any building equipped with appropriate collection equipment. The replacement of such systems with centralized power generation based on fuel consumption created ongoing revenue streams for energy companies while making users dependent on external suppliers for essential services. The coal and oil industries that became dominant during this period had powerful economic incentives to suppress alternative energy technologies that might have reduced demand for their products. Atmospheric power collection, if it worked, would have eliminated the need for fuel-based power generation entirely, making these industries economically irrelevant. The systematic removal of atmospheric collection equipment from buildings and its replacement with conventional electrical systems may have been driven by economic interest rather than technological improvements. The patent system that emerged during this period also played a role in controlling technological development and maintaining economic advantages for established interests. Technologies that might have competed with profitable industries could be suppressed through patent acquisition and non-development, ensuring that alternative approaches remained unavailable to potential competitors. The patent system officially encouraged innovation, but could also be used to prevent innovations that threatened established economic interests. The standardization of weights, measures, currencies, and commercial practices also contributed to centralized economic control. While officially justified as improvements that facilitated trade and commerce, these standardizations also eliminated local variations that had provided economic independence for regional communities. Local currencies, traditional measurement systems, and customary commercial practices all gave way to standardized systems that integrated local economies into larger networks controlled from distant centers. The legal frameworks that supported these economic transformations also show evidence of coordination across different jurisdictions. Property laws, commercial regulations, and financial systems were modified with remarkable consistency across different countries, creating legal environments that supported the new economic arrangements while eliminating legal protections for traditional economic relationships. These legal changes were essential to the economic transformation, but were implemented with coordination that suggests planning beyond what individual national governments would have undertaken independently. The educational systems that were established during this period also served economic functions by training populations for the new economic arrangements, while discouraging knowledge and skills that might have supported economic independence. Traditional crafts, local production methods, and resource management techniques that had provided economic self-sufficiency were gradually eliminated from educational curricula in favor of training that prepared workers for employment in centralized industrial systems. The cultural changes that accompanied economic transformation also served to support the new economic arrangements. Traditional values that emphasized local community, economic self-sufficiency, and resource conservation were replaced with cultural values that emphasize consumption, economic growth, and dependence on external systems. These cultural changes were essential to creating populations that would accept and support economic systems based on artificial scarcity and centralized control. For those willing to consider the economic evidence, the pattern suggests that the historical reset may have been driven primarily by economic motives rather than political or cultural ones. The transformation from abundance-based to scarcity-based economics, the establishment of centralized control over energy and resources, and the creation of artificial dependencies all served economic interests that benefited from the elimination of alternative economic arrangements that may have provided greater prosperity and independence for general populations. The economic reset required the systematic suppression of technologies, social arrangements, and historical knowledge that supported alternative economic possibilities. Free energy technologies, abundant resources, and sophisticated civilizations that provided prosperity without artificial scarcity all represented threats to economic systems based on controlled scarcity and centralized profit extraction. The elimination of evidence for such alternatives was essential to maintaining economic systems that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of those who controlled resource distribution. The money remembers what the history books choose to ignore. In the financial records, patent filings, and commercial development patterns lies evidence of economic motives powerful enough to drive the systematic rewriting of human history. The greatest cover-up in human history may not have been political or military, but economic. The concealment of human potential for abundance in service of systems that profit from artificial scarcity. If the Tartarian narrative holds even fragments of truth, then its erasure from collective memory represents perhaps the most coordinated act of historical suppression ever undertaken. Consider the scale of such an endeavor. Across continents, through multiple languages, spanning diverse political systems, the same civilization simply vanishes from official records within a remarkably narrow time frame. This was not the gradual forgetting that comes with the passage of centuries, but something far more deliberate and systematic. The late 18th and early 19th centuries mark a curious watershed in global record-keeping. It is during this period that we see the establishment of national archives, the standardization of historical methodologies, and the birth of archaeology as a formal discipline. Yet it is also precisely when references to vast Tartarian territories begin to disappear from newly published atlases and encyclopedias. Maps that had depicted sprawling Tartarian kingdoms across Asia for 2 centuries suddenly show these regions divided into smaller, more manageable political entities, or simply labelled as unexplored wilderness. This synchronicity suggests coordination at a level that transcends individual nations or empires. The major colonial powers of the era, Britain, France, Spain, Russia, despite their conflicts and competitions, appear to have reached an unspoken consensus about which histories would be preserved and which would be allowed to fade. Treaties from this period, while primarily concerned with territorial boundaries and trade rights, contain curious clauses about the management of indigenous narratives and the standardization of geographical nomenclature that hint at deeper agreements about the control of information itself. The most striking evidence for coordinated suppression lies in the remarkable uniformity with which Tartarian references were edited out of historical documents across different cultures. In China, imperial records that had acknowledged Tartarian territories for centuries were quietly amended during the Qing dynasty's later period, with entire sections dedicated to northern neighbours simply omitted from new editions. In Russia, where Tartarian presence had been an acknowledged reality for generations, official histories began portraying these same regions as sparsely populated frontier lands awaiting Russian development. Even more telling is the treatment of indigenous oral traditions. Across Siberia, Central Asia, and the Americas, tribal elders report that their grandparents spoke of great cities and advanced peoples who simply went below or returned to the inner earth during a time of great upheaval. These stories, once central to cultural identity, were gradually discouraged by missionaries, colonial administrators, and later by national governments implementing modernization programs. The consistency of this pattern from the Mongolian steppes to the American plains suggests a shared understanding among authorities about which memories were acceptable and which needed to be reshaped. The educational reforms of the 19th century played a crucial role in this process. Across Europe and its colonial territories, new curricula were implemented that emphasized scientific history over folkloric traditions. This shift, while presented as progress toward rationality, had the effect of delegitimizing any historical account that couldn't be verified through approved documentation, since Tartarian records were simultaneously being removed from archives. This created a self-reinforcing cycle where the absence of official evidence became proof of non-existence. Perhaps no aspect of the coordination is more revealing than the global adoption of the Gregorian calendar system and the standardization of dating conventions during this same crucial period. While officially presented as practical necessities for international trade and communication, these changes had profound implications for historical continuity. Local dating systems, many of which preserved references to Tartarian periods or events, were gradually replaced by a universal framework that recognized only approved historical markers. The transition was rarely smooth or voluntary. In Russia, the calendar reform of 1918 involved not just changing dates, but rewriting historical chronicles to conform to the new system. Documents that had dated events according to Tartarian rulers or astronomical observations were corrected to reflect the new standardized timeline. Similar processes occurred across the former Ottoman territories, in colonial administrations throughout Asia, and even in the Americas where indigenous timekeeping systems were systematically replaced. This standardization created what historians call temporal nationalism, the idea that all peoples within a given territory shared the same historical timeline and cultural development. Events that didn't fit this narrative, such as advanced Tartarian infrastructure appearing in supposedly primitive regions, were either attributed to later colonial development or dismissed as historical anomalies. Deep in the archives of various foreign ministries, careful researchers have uncovered references to what appear to be agreements about historical interpretation. The Congress of Vienna in 1815, while primarily focused on redrawing European boundaries after Napoleon's defeat, included numerous closed sessions whose minutes remain classified or have mysteriously vanished. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence hints at discussions about narrative management and the need for consistent historical foundations to support the new political order. Similar patterns emerge from other major 19th century diplomatic gatherings. The Berlin Conference of 1884-85, ostensibly about the partition of Africa, included provisions about the standardization of cartographical and ethnographic records that went far beyond practical mapping needs. Representatives agreed to coordinate their historical and anthropological documentation, ensuring that colonial territories would be described in ways that supported claims of civilizational superiority and justified resource extraction. These diplomatic protocols established mechanisms for sharing archaeological findings, coordinating museum acquisitions, and even determining which ancient texts would be translated and disseminated. Artifacts that challenged approved historical narratives had a curious tendency to disappear into private collections or government storage facilities, while those that supported colonial justifications were prominently displayed and widely published. Colonial administrations became the primary instruments through which alternative historical narratives were suppressed. British officials in India, French administrators in North Africa, and Russian governors in Central Asia all implemented similar policies. Collect and catalogue indigenous historical records, then selectively preserve only those that supported colonial objectives. Documents describing advanced pre-colonial civilizations, sophisticated trade networks, or autonomous political systems were classified as culturally sensitive and restricted from public access. The missionary systems played an equally crucial role, often serving as the intellectual arm of narrative control. Religious missions were uniquely positioned to access local oral traditions, sacred texts, and community memories that civil authorities might never encounter. Under the guise of documenting indigenous cultures for preservation, missionaries systematically recorded and then selectively reported these traditions, emphasizing elements that portrayed pre-Christian societies as primitive or chaotic, while suppressing accounts of advanced knowledge or stable governance. Educational institutions in colonial territories were designed to reinforce these narratives. Native students were taught histories that began with the arrival of their colonial administrators, with pre-contact periods described as prehistory, a term that inherently diminished the significance of indigenous achievements. Tartarian references in local traditions were reframed as garbled memories of early European contact or mythological embellishments of natural phenomena. One of the most puzzling aspects of the Tartarian mystery involves the communication systems that appear to have connected vast territories long before the development of modern telecommunications. Historical accounts describe message networks that could relay information across the entire Eurasian continent in a matter of days, a feat that shouldn't have been possible with the transportation technology officially attributed to the period. These systems seem to have operated through a combination of mounted messengers, signal fires, and what some researchers interpret as more advanced methods. Marco Polo's accounts, while heavily focused on trade routes, contain passing references to voice-carrying stones and talking mountains that suggest communication methods beyond simple relay systems. Similar descriptions appear in Chinese imperial records, Islamic travel narratives, and even in the journals of early European explorers who noted the impossibly rapid spread of news across regions where no formal postal systems were supposed to exist. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of these networks. Across Central Asia, researchers have identified extensive systems of underground tunnels and chambers, many containing carved stone channels that exhibit acoustic properties, allowing sound to travel vast distances with remarkable clarity. While mainstream archaeology attributes these to ancient mining operations or defensive systems, their positioning and design suggest a more sophisticated purpose related to long-distance communication. The speed with which similar policies were implemented across the globe during the supposed Tartarian suppression period defies explanation through conventional means. Changes in mapping conventions, educational curricula, and historical documentation occurred simultaneously across continents, in an era when international communication should have taken months or years. This suggests either the existence of communication networks far more advanced than officially acknowledged, or coordination planned decades in advance through institutions whose activities remain hidden from historical scrutiny. Consider the timing of the great world's fairs of the late 19th century. These massive undertakings involving the construction of temporary cities filled with advanced architecture and technology appeared in major capitals around the world within remarkably narrow timeframes. The coordination required for such projects, the movement of materials, the training of workers, the development of new construction techniques, implies communication and planning capabilities that exceed what historians attribute to the period. Official explanations focus on improved steamship and rail networks, but the scale and precision of coordination suggests something more systematic. documents from the period reference, preparatory committees, and international planning boards, whose membership and activities remain largely undocumented, yet whose influence can be traced through the remarkable similarity of approaches taken by supposedly independent national and colonial administrations. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of Tartarian research involves claims of vast underground tunnel networks connecting distant continents. While mainstream archaeology acknowledges the existence of extensive tunnel systems in various parts of the world, the idea that these might be connected across oceanic distances challenges fundamental assumptions about ancient engineering capabilities. Evidence for such networks comes from multiple sources. Indigenous traditions from the Americas speak of underground passages that lead to the other side of the world, with specific references to destinations that correspond geographically to Asian locations. Similar accounts exist in Asian cultures, describing tunnels that emerge in lands where the sun sets in the water, which could refer to western coastlines. More intriguingly, geological surveys have identified anomalous cavities and voids in the Earth's crust that follow remarkably straight lines across vast distances. These formations, while officially attributed to natural processes, exhibit engineering characteristics that suggest intentional construction. Seismic studies reveal chambers and passages at depths that would have required advanced excavation technology, positioned with mathematical precision that implies sophisticated surveying capabilities. Historical records contain tantalizing references to transportation methods that disappeared along with other Tartarian technologies. These range from descriptions of vehicles that moved without visible means of propulsion to accounts of structures that enabled rapid travel across vast distances. While such references are typically dismissed as mythological embellishments, their consistency across different cultures and time periods suggests possible historical foundations. Railway development in the 19th century provides a curious case study in this regard. The speed with which rail networks appeared in previously undeveloped regions often exceeded the documented pace of construction, leading to speculation that new railways were built upon foundations of older transportation infrastructure. Archaeological investigations of early rail lines have occasionally uncovered evidence of pre-existing engineered surfaces and support structures that appear to predate official construction timelines. Aviation history also contains anomalies that hint at suppressed developments. Patents filed in the mid-19th century describe aircraft designs of remarkable sophistication, yet these innovations allegedly led nowhere until the Wright brothers documented achievements decades later. The legacy of 19th-century narrative control continues to influence contemporary archaeological practices in ways that effectively prevent investigation of Tartarian claims. Funding for archaeological projects is typically awarded based on research proposals that align with established historical frameworks, creating a systematic bias against investigations that might challenge accepted timelines or cultural developments. Access restrictions play an equally important role. Many of the sites most relevant to Tartarian research are located in politically sensitive regions, protected areas, or zones under military control. Permits for excavation or survey work are routinely denied for reasons that range from environmental protection to national security, often without clear justification. Independent researchers attempting to access these areas frequently encounter bureaucratic obstacles that seem designed to discourage rather than facilitate scientific inquiry. International archaeological protocols, while ostensibly designed to prevent cultural exploitation, have the practical effect of limiting investigation to approved institutions and methodologies. These restrictions ensure that any discoveries remain within established academic and governmental channels, where interpretation can be managed to support existing narratives rather than challenge them. Modern media systems continue the patterns of narrative control established during the Tartarian suppression period, though with more sophisticated methods. Rather than simply omitting inconvenient information, contemporary approaches involve presenting alternative theories in contexts that encourage dismissal, associating them with fringe movements, sensationalizing claims to discredit serious research, or overwhelming genuine investigation with deliberately absurd variations that conflate legitimate inquiry with obvious fantasy. Documentary programming about alternative history follows predictable formats that present intriguing evidence, but ultimately reinforce mainstream interpretations through carefully selected expert commentary and editing choices that emphasize uncertainty over possibility. This approach maintains public interest while channeling it towards safe conclusions that don't threaten established institutions or power structures. Social media platforms, despite their democratic potential, have become sophisticated tools for narrative management through algorithmic control of information distribution. Content questioning official historical narratives is systematically deprioritized, relegated to specialist communities, or flagged for fact-checking by organizations whose funding sources create clear conflicts of interest regarding historical truth. The academic establishment continues to function as a primary mechanism for controlling historical narratives through institutional gatekeeping. Career advancement in historical and archaeological fields depends on adherence to approved interpretations, with deviation from orthodox positions resulting in professional marginalization regardless of evidence quality. This system ensures that challenges to established narratives remain confined to amateur researchers who lack institutional credibility. Peer review processes, while theoretically designed to maintain academic standards, often function as ideological filters that prevent publication of research questioning fundamental historical assumptions. Journals routinely reject papers presenting evidence for advanced ancient civilizations or alternative chronologies, not because of methodological flaws, but because conclusions don't align with editorial policies that support current paradigms. University curricula reinforce these patterns by presenting history as settled science rather than ongoing investigation. Students are taught to view alternative theories as examples of poor reasoning rather than legitimate areas of inquiry, creating each generation of scholars predisposed to reject evidence that challenges what they've been taught to accept as established fact. The implications of confirming Tartarian civilization extend far beyond academic curiosity into realms that could destabilize fundamental aspects of contemporary society. Economic systems based on scarcity and extraction might prove unsustainable when compared to evidence of advanced societies that achieved prosperity through harmony with natural systems rather than domination over them. Political legitimacy often rests on historical narratives that justify current arrangements of power and authority. Revelation of advanced pre-colonial civilizations would undermine claims about the necessity of current institutional structures and raise uncomfortable questions about whether modern progress represents advancement or regression from earlier achievements. Religious and philosophical frameworks might also face challenges from evidence of spiritual and intellectual traditions that predate and potentially surpass current understandings. Many contemporary belief systems are predicated on the assumption that human knowledge and capability have progressed linearly, from primitive origins toward current sophistication. Evidence of earlier civilizations with advanced understanding of consciousness, energy, and natural law would require fundamental reassessment of these assumptions. Perhaps most significantly, acknowledgement of Tartarian civilization would force recognition that powerful institutions have deliberately suppressed historical truth for centuries, raising questions about what other information has been hidden and why. Such revelation could catalyze demands for transparency and accountability that current power structures are unprepared to address. The camera, that most honest of witnesses, arrived in human hands just as the last traces of Tartarian civilization were allegedly being erased from the landscape. Yet in those earliest photographic records, captured with the crude but unflinching honesty of daguerreotypes and glass plates, lie perhaps the most compelling fragments of evidence for what was supposedly impossible. Structures of impossible grandeur rising from ground that had been mapped as empty wilderness just years before. Consider the photographs from the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Official records claim these magnificent neoclassical buildings, spanning hundreds of acres and exhibiting architectural sophistication that rivals the greatest monuments of antiquity, were constructed in just 2 years by a city that had been largely destroyed by fire barely 2 decades earlier. Yet the photographic evidence reveals construction techniques, material precision, and artistic details that challenge everything we understand about late 19th century building capabilities. The massive structures appear not as temporary exhibition halls hastily assembled from wood and plaster, but as permanent monuments built from materials that seem to glow with an inner light. Stone blocks fitted with tolerances that modern construction rarely achieves, decorative elements carved with a precision that should have taken master craftsmen years to complete, electrical illumination systems that official records claim were impossibly advanced for their time. The photographs capture not just buildings, but an entire alternative reality of what American cities might have been. Similar anomalies appear in early photographs from cities around the world. The rapid appearance of grand architectural districts in San Francisco, the mysterious overnight completion of elaborate government buildings across the expanding American territories, the construction of railway stations and public works that seem to emerge fully formed from landscapes that had shown no previous development. In each case, the photographic evidence contradicts official construction timelines by margins that strain credibility. Perhaps more telling than construction photographs are the images documenting destruction, the systematic demolition of structures whose origins had become inconvenient to official narratives. Archives from the early 20th century contain extensive documentation of what authorities described as clearing obsolete infrastructure or removing fire hazards. Yet the buildings being destroyed often exhibit architectural sophistication and structural integrity that surpass contemporary construction. The photographs reveal a troubling pattern. Structures that appear to be in excellent condition, showing no signs of decay or structural failure, being systematically demolished by crews whose equipment and techniques suggest careful, deliberate destruction rather than emergency clearing of dangerous buildings. These are not the hasty demolitions of genuinely unstable structures, but methodical dismantling operations that seem designed to erase evidence rather than ensure safety. In city after city, the same sequence appears in municipal archives. First, photographs showing magnificent buildings in pristine condition. Then, administrative documents declaring these structures unsuitable for modern use, or impediments to urban development. Finally, images of empty lots where architectural marvels had stood, often with official statements about successful completion of urban renewal projects. The timing of these demolitions follows suspicious patterns. Structures are removed not when they become genuinely obsolete, but when their existence begins to contradict emerging official histories about local development. Buildings whose architectural styles don't match approved narratives about cultural progression are eliminated, leaving only those structures that support the story authorities want to tell about how their cities developed. Even more revealing than what early photographs show is what later versions of the same images omit. Comparative analysis of photographs published in different periods reveals systematic cropping and editing designed to remove inconvenient details that might suggest alternative historical interpretations. Museum archives and historical societies contain original glass plates and negatives that show significantly more detail than published versions of the same images. Backgrounds containing architectural elements that don't fit official timelines are cropped out. Structures displaying advanced technology or unfamiliar design elements are airbrushed away. Groups of people whose clothing, appearance, or activities suggest different cultural or technological contexts are removed from later printings. This editing process was particularly intensive during the mid-20th century, when many historical societies undertook modernization programs that involved improving their photographic collections. Original images were systematically replaced with cropped, edited versions that supported approved historical narratives. The original materials often disappeared entirely, claimed to have been damaged by age or lost due to storage failures. The sophistication of this editing suggests coordination beyond individual institutional decisions. Similar modifications appear in archives across different countries and continents, implying shared standards for what elements of historical photography were acceptable for public viewing and which needed to be removed to maintain narrative consistency. While institutional archives were systematically cleaned of inconvenient evidence, private family collections retained photographs that official channels eliminated. These personal documents, passed down through generations of families who had no understanding of their historical significance, often contain the most revealing glimpses of suppressed architectural heritage. Amateur photographers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, working with simple equipment and lacking official guidance about what should or shouldn't be documented, created inadvertent records of structures and technologies that official sources ignore. Wedding photographs taken in front of magnificent buildings that don't appear in any municipal records. Family portraits posed before architectural details that suggest advanced construction techniques. Vacation pictures, capturing structures in remote locations that official maps show as uninhabited wilderness. These personal archives become particularly valuable when compared with official documentation from the same periods and locations. The contrast between what families considered normal enough to use as backdrops for personal photographs and what authorities chose to document as representative of local development often reveals systematic omissions in official records. Recent efforts to digitize family archives have begun revealing the extent of these omissions. Online genealogy projects and historical preservation efforts have uncovered thousands of photographs containing architectural evidence that contradicts official historical narratives, suggesting that suppression of Tartarian evidence was less complete than authorities might have intended. The literature of the 18th and 19th centuries contains numerous references to established cities and civilizations in regions that official histories claim were wilderness or sparsely populated frontier territories. These references appear not in fiction, but in travel accounts, business correspondence, and governmental documents written by authors who had no reason to invent or exaggerate the urban development they encountered. Trade journals from the period describe commercial relationships with cities whose names appear in no modern atlas, yet were apparently significant enough to warrant regular business correspondence and detailed descriptions of local customs, architectural styles, and economic systems. These accounts often include specific details about urban planning, technological infrastructure, and cultural institutions that suggest far more advanced civilizations than official histories acknowledge. Military correspondence reveals similar anomalies. Officers stationed in supposedly undeveloped territories write detailed reports about fortified cities, elaborate governmental systems, and sophisticated military organizations they encountered. Yet these same regions are described in official histories as uninhabited or populated only by nomadic peoples. The disconnect between first-hand accounts and official historical narratives suggests systematic editing of records to support preferred interpretations of territorial development. Diplomatic records contain references to treaties and agreements with political entities that subsequently disappear from official acknowledgement. Ambassadors describe complex negotiations with representatives of established governments, complete with detailed accounts of palace ceremonies, legal systems, and cultural protocols. Yet these same political entities vanish from later historical documentation as though they had never existed. Personal travel accounts from the 17th through 19th centuries frequently describe encountering infrastructure and technology that official histories claim didn't exist in the regions being traversed. These accounts, written for private correspondence or personal journals rather than official publication, often contain details that contradict accepted narratives about technological development and cultural advancement. Travelers describe roads paved with materials and constructed with techniques that surpass contemporary European standards, bridges spanning distances that should have been impossible with available engineering knowledge, and urban water systems displaying sophistication that major European cities wouldn't achieve for decades. These descriptions appear with such frequency and consistency that dismissing them all as exaggeration or misunderstanding strains credibility. Particularly intriguing are accounts of energy and lighting systems that seem to have no parallel in acknowledged technological development of the period. Multiple independent sources describe cities illuminated by means other than fire or gas, buildings that maintained comfortable temperatures without visible heating systems, and mechanical devices that operated without apparent power sources. While such descriptions might be dismissed individually as misunderstandings of unfamiliar technology, Their occurrence across different authors and locations suggests systematic encounter with advanced systems. Communication technologies also appear in these accounts with surprising frequency. Travelers describe methods of long-distance communication that enabled rapid information transfer across vast territories, navigation systems that provided accurate geographical positioning, and transportation networks that connected remote regions with efficiency that wouldn't be officially achieved until much later periods. Comparative analysis of multiple editions of the same text reveals systematic removal of references to advanced civilizations and technologies over time. Books that were initially published with detailed descriptions of sophisticated societies encountered during exploration gradually lose these elements in later editions, often with no editorial explanation for the deletions. This editing process was particularly intensive during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when many classical travel accounts were republished in modernized editions that claimed to correct errors or update geographical information. However, the actual changes often involved removing specific details about technological and cultural advancement, rather than correcting factual inaccuracies. Publishers' archives, where they survive, reveal correspondence about the need to modify text to align with current understanding of historical development. Editors received instructions to remove descriptions that might confuse readers or perpetuate outdated geographical concepts. Yet the eliminated material often consisted of precise technical descriptions, rather than obviously erroneous information. The systematic nature of these modifications suggests coordination beyond individual editorial decisions. Similar changes appear in texts published by different companies in different countries, implying shared standards for what types of historical information were acceptable for public consumption and which needed to be eliminated to maintain approved narratives. Some of the most detailed descriptions of advanced ancient civilizations appear in works officially classified as fiction, raising questions about whether these represent imaginative creation or disguised historical documentation. Authors of the 18th and 19th centuries often used fictional frameworks to present information that might be censored or discredited if presented as factual reporting. Jules Verne's technical descriptions in Journey to the Center of the Earth display remarkable accuracy regarding geological conditions and engineering possibilities that wouldn't be confirmed until much later. His detailed accounts of subterranean cities and advanced technologies read less like pure imagination and more like technical documentation presented in narrative form. Similar patterns appear in works by authors throughout the period, suggesting possible use of fictional formats to preserve suppressed historical information. Early science fiction often contains descriptions of technologies and social systems that seem too detailed and technically sophisticated to be pure invention. Authors describe specific engineering principles, architectural techniques, and organizational structures with precision that suggests familiarity with actual examples rather than speculative creation. The consistency of these descriptions across different authors and periods implies possible shared sources of information that official channels had excluded. Literary analysis reveals that many works classified as fantasy contain geographical descriptions that correspond precisely to real locations, architectural details that match archaeological discoveries, and technical specifications that prove feasible when examined by modern engineering standards. This precision suggests that fictional accounts may preserve historical information that official sources have eliminated. Geographic nomenclature across the globe preserves linguistic fossils of Tartarian presence in regions where official histories claim such civilization never existed. Place names often survive long after the cultures that created them have disappeared, maintaining linguistic evidence of historical realities that later authorities prefer to forget. Across Central Asia, Siberia, and even into Eastern Europe, toponyms containing variations of Tartar, or related linguistic roots appear with remarkable frequency. Yet many of these locations show no official historical connection to acknowledged Tartarian political entities. These names often include linguistic elements suggesting advanced urban development, technological infrastructure, or sophisticated political organization in areas that official histories describe as wilderness or nomadic territories. North American geographic names reveal similar patterns. Indigenous place names across the continent contain linguistic elements that correspond to Tartarian languages, particularly in regions where oral traditions speak of contact with advanced peoples from distant lands. These linguistic connections suggest cultural contact or population movement that official histories of North American development don't acknowledge. Even more intriguing are place names that appear simultaneously in widely separated geographic regions, suggesting either systematic migration patterns or communication networks spanning vast distances. Names containing similar linguistic roots appear in locations across different continents, often in areas that official histories claim had no contact with each other during relevant historical periods. Comparative linguistic analysis reveals structural similarities between languages across regions that official histories claim developed in complete isolation from each other. These similarities extend beyond the occasional shared words that might result from trade contact to include fundamental grammatical structures, phonetic patterns, and conceptual frameworks that suggest shared cultural origins. Technical terminology related to architecture, engineering, and urban planning shows remarkable consistency across languages that supposedly had no contact during their formative periods. Terms for specific building techniques, mathematical concepts, and organizational systems appear in nearly identical forms across different continents, implying either systematic cultural diffusion or common historical origins that official linguistic theories don't acknowledge. Religious and philosophical terminology exhibits similar patterns. Concepts related to advanced spiritual practices, cosmological understanding, and ethical systems appear in languages across widely separated regions using nearly identical linguistic structures. This consistency extends beyond simple vocabulary to include complex conceptual relationships that suggest shared intellectual traditions spanning vast geographical areas. Even more revealing are linguistic patterns related to technology and scientific understanding. Languages across different continents contain technical terminology that describes devices, processes, and scientific principles using remarkably similar linguistic constructions, often in areas where official histories claim no advanced technological development occurred during relevant periods. Historical records reveal extensive programs of geographic renaming that coincided with the supposed suppression of Tartarian civilization. Mountains, rivers, regions, and cities that had carried names for centuries were systematically redesignated with new nomenclature that eliminated references to Tartarian cultural or political entities. These renaming programs were presented as efforts to standardize geographical terminology or honor contemporary political figures. Yet the systematic nature of the changes suggests coordination beyond practical administrative needs. Names containing any linguistic connection to Tartarian roots were replaced with alternatives that supported emerging official narratives about regional development and cultural history. Colonial administrations were particularly active in this process, implementing comprehensive renaming programs that eliminated indigenous place names in favor of European alternatives. However, the changes went beyond simple cultural imperialism to specifically target names that suggested advanced pre-colonial civilizations or sophisticated political organizations that contradicted narratives about civilizational development. Modern digital mapping systems have accelerated this process, with traditional place names disappearing from official usage even in regions where local populations continue to use historical terminology. GPS systems and online mapping services systematically favor official names over traditional alternatives, gradually eliminating linguistic evidence of suppressed historical realities from practical usage. Perhaps the most revealing linguistic evidence appears in translation errors that inadvertently preserve original meanings authorities intended to suppress. Early translators, working with limited cultural knowledge and political guidance, sometimes rendered texts literally rather than adapting them to support preferred narratives, creating windows into suppressed historical realities. Historical documents translated during different periods reveal systematic reinterpretation of terms related to advanced technologies, sophisticated political systems, and cultural achievements. Earlier translations often preserve descriptions of technological capabilities and social organization that later versions modify or eliminate to support official narratives about cultural development. Religious and philosophical texts show similar patterns. Sacred works translated during periods when suppression was less systematic often contain references to advanced scientific knowledge, technological capabilities, and cultural achievements that disappear from later translations of the same source materials. Comparison of these versions reveals systematic editing designed to eliminate information that contradicts approved historical narratives. Technical texts present particularly clear evidence of deliberate mistranslation. Documents describing architectural techniques, engineering principles, and organizational systems show systematic rendering of technical terminology in ways that diminish rather than accurately represent the sophistication of described methods. These errors appear too consistent and purposeful to represent simple misunderstanding of source materials. If the suppressed history of Tartaria were to be fully revealed and acknowledged, humanity would stand to recover far more than academic curiosity satisfied. The technological heritage alone could revolutionize our approach to sustainable living, offering time-tested methods for harmony between human civilization and natural systems. Where our current models depend on extraction and exploitation, Tartarian examples might demonstrate abundance achieved through cooperation with, rather than domination over environmental forces. The architectural knowledge embedded in these hidden traditions could transform how we construct our cities and communities. Buildings that last centuries without maintenance, urban planning that enhances rather than disrupts natural water cycles, energy systems that draw from the Earth's own fields rather than depleting finite resources. These are not fantasies, but possibilities supported by evidence scattered throughout the suppressed historical record. Perhaps most valuable would be the organizational wisdom preserved in Tartarian social structures, models of governance that maintain stability across vast territories without the constant warfare that has defined so much of acknowledged history, economic systems that achieved prosperity without creating scarcity, educational approaches that produced both technical competence and ethical maturity. Such examples could guide our evolution beyond the cycles of rise and collapse that have characterized surface civilizations for millennia. The revelation of Tartarian truth would inevitably challenge institutions whose authority rests on controlling historical narratives and maintaining artificial scarcity. Educational systems that have shaped generations to accept current limitations as inevitable would face questions about what other possibilities have been deliberately hidden. Economic structures built on resource competition would lose legitimacy if confronted with evidence of sustainable abundance achieved through different approaches. Political power structures that justify their authority through claims about civilizational progress would find their foundations undermined by proof of earlier achievements that surpass contemporary capabilities. Religious orthodoxies that position current spiritual understanding as the culmination of human development would need to acknowledge traditions that may have reached greater depths of wisdom centuries ago. Most significantly, the institutions responsible for historical suppression would face accountability for decisions that have shaped human development in ways that prioritize control over truth, short-term advantage over long-term wisdom. The revelation that such suppression occurred would inevitably lead to questions about what other information has been hidden and why. We stand at a threshold where individual investigation must balance respect for established knowledge with courage to question foundational assumptions. The comfortable path accepts authorized narratives and avoids the discomfort of confronting the possibility that much of what we've been taught represents deliberate limitation rather than natural truth. The alternative requires embracing uncertainty while maintaining critical thinking, pursuing evidence while avoiding the trap of believing every alternative simply because it contradicts official versions. It demands the humility to acknowledge that our current understanding may be incomplete, and the patience to build better frameworks slowly rather than destroying existing knowledge recklessly. Perhaps most importantly, it requires recognizing that the ultimate purpose of uncovering suppressed history is not to shame those who accepted authorized narratives, but to reclaim possibilities that have been hidden from human development. Whether the gates to forgotten wisdom open through archaeological discovery, systematic investigation, or the gradual awakening of collective memory, the goal remains the same: to recover our full heritage as conscious beings capable of creating civilizations worthy of our highest aspirations. The choice is ours, made daily through decisions about what to investigate, what to question, and what responsibilities we accept for the future we're creating. In that choice lies both the challenge and the promise of truth revealed.